Coming up on Avant, Technology Insights with Ken Presti.
Security is intrinsic in every single thing that a business does. You cannot do anything today in business without taking into account security.
We'll be talking to a leader in the area of IT security who recently published an article in Forbes entitled Embracing the New Business World, 5 Key Considerations for CISOs. We'll talk about balancing risk, resilience and disaster planning, how distributed workforces affect the attack surfaces, the development, communication, and adherence to policy, and a whole lot more. Quick side note to my audio geek brothers and sisters out there, plus those seeking to enter the geekhood. This guy's in the UK, I was in Chicago, and the sound quality is awesome. Enjoy it all, it's coming up next. Welcome to Avant Technology Insights. I'm your host, Ken Presti, Research Vice President of Avant Research and Analytics. The link between solving business challenges and cutting-edge technologies has become tighter and more complex than ever before. In this podcast series from Avant Research and Analytics, we help enterprise decision-makers sort through the business case, the value, the challenges, and ultimately the bottom line of technology adoption. So listen to us at your desktop, take us in the car, tune in from the commuter train, or download us at the gate. You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google, as well as at www.goavant.net/podcast. My guest today is an international business leader with a primary focus on strategy, information technology, cybersecurity, and the emerging cyber risk and threat landscape. He leads a major security organization that helps professionals to better understand security in today's environment through research, tools, advice, and guidance. He's a member of the Forbes Business Council and managing director of the Information Security Forum. I want to welcome Steve Durbin. Steve, thank you very much for joining us today. Information security, always a hot topic. And I ran across your article in Forbes I believe it was on September 1st, entitled Embracing the New Business World, 5 Key Considerations for CISOs. Let's start with kind of the overarching question, I guess. What led you to write this article to begin with? What was your mission, if you will?
Yeah, I think, Ken, the key sort of driver behind this one was, we're in the middle of pandemic, doesn't seem to be going away. CISOs that I work with have been really finding it difficult for some while to get some of the messages across within their businesses, to boards in particular, that level of understanding of what it is that they need to do to keep companies safe. The pandemic really shone a light on that. And so it seemed to me that there was a need, if you like, to just offer up a few really simple key considerations that I believe are important to the way in which security emerges post-pandemic. And I think perhaps more importantly, seizes what I see to be a very real opportunity for CISOs to be establishing themselves right at the top of organizations in terms of supporting the way that businesses emerge from the dreadful situation that so many people have been finding themselves in over the past few months.
So I'm hearing two different things about security these days. One is that the pandemic has made everyone a lot more security focused. The other is that the reverse is true, that people are looking to save money in any way that they can, and security is one of the areas where they may not be investing as much as they otherwise might. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things have happened. I think that certainly when the pandemic really hit, when most of the world moved into lockdown, there was a very necessary focus on security. So we've now got users all over the place in environments that are far from secure. And so the role of security was to really do triage in the early days. And so the focus was there. And I think there was an opportunity point there as well going forward for CISOs and for security folks in general to really establish themselves as being able to support the business through a transitionary period. The second piece is that as we now see a number of countries emerging, albeit slowly in a sort of stop-start fashion from pandemic, we're being hit with recession. One of the worst recessions that certainly I have seen, that most people have ever seen. And that is causing quite a natural reaction, I think, within most organizations, particularly in the CFO office, to say, okay, let's cut back on everything that we can. That's the knee-jerk reaction. And then we'll start to build back up again. Now, that's a real challenge for a lot of security people, because there are some things that they're not too good at. One of them is really, I think, advocating for themselves at the board level in terms of positioning the importance of their function. They traditionally, the CISO has tended to be an individual that just gets on and does the job. They've worked in the background, they've done an excellent job, but perhaps that hasn't been recognized as much as it might be. And so, we've written at the ISF a piece very recently that's called "Becoming a Next Generation CISO," that talks about the need to balance business opportunity with risk, to demonstrate leadership, to really manage all of the things that a CISO is expected to do, but to do that in a way that is very obvious to the business, and to convey the messages that are necessary for the business to really understand that actually this is a function that you cannot do without. And I talk a lot about this. Security is intrinsic in every single thing that a business does. You cannot do anything today in business without taking into account security. And that's the position that we're now in. So we're having to migrate into that at a time, of course, when everybody is looking to see where they can save money.
So the CISO, you mentioned a moment ago that the CISO is kind of the person who does that job in the background and it just gets done. You think part of this, and I actually hadn't thought of this before. So, I mean, this is kind of I'm formulating this sort of on the fly based on what you just said. If I put my corner office hat on and I know I've got to make cuts, do you think there is perhaps even a subconscious aspect of this that says, I'm going to cut the budgets of the people who are going to scream the least? And because my security guy is very tech focused and may not be comfortable in terms of coming forth and having this discussion with me, that's going to be a target.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that you said a very interesting thing there, though, Ken. You said that the security guy is traditionally very tech focused, very tech centric, something like that. I,
Hmm.
I think that this again is one of the challenges for some CISOs. They fit into the IT department. Security has nothing to do with IT, as far as I'm concerned. Security is all about understanding the role that technology has to play in the business. But security really is about then making sure that the business is as secure as it needs to be, as determined by the board of directors, because they determine the risk profile. And so, in determining that the business is as secure as it needs to be across all of the different technology platforms that exist. So, for me, it's a very separate entity, and not all businesses see it that way. All too often, it is lumped in with technology, and I think you're right. I think that let's cut from where we're going to get the least resistance. And so I think that the CISOs that I know that are not seeing significant cuts in their budgets are the ones that have worked really closely with the business to align what they do with new business initiatives, with how do we, in a recession, gain new customers? How do we continue to maintain customer satisfaction at levels that are going to really separate us from the pack? How do we ensure that our supply chain is safe? We're seeing organizations having to change that construct of supply chain regularly now, not just because of pandemic, because of the impact of recession. We're seeing a lot of M&A perhaps going on in the supply chain. We've seen some providers of services simply going out of business, not being able to function, and so organizations have had to find other suppliers. And security has an integral role to play in making sure that that works effectively, efficiently, and within the risk parameters that the business wishes to operate within.
So your article is about 5 key concerns for CISOs, and at the top of that list is risk management. Now, risk management is always important, but why is that aspect of it particularly important now that that was at the top of your list?
Yeah, this one is Really, because this is what I believe it's all about at the moment. It's how do we balance risk? We had, and we talked about the pandemic, about the impact that had on organizations. Everybody went off into their different homes and operated. Now we've got a hybrid situation where people are starting to come back into the workplace. We're starting to see business um, begin to roll out some of the delayed long-term projects, perhaps investments that they had. But we're having to balance that against perhaps shortage in resource, perhaps shortage in finances, a different way perhaps in which the regulatory landscape is changing. And so the job for me of the CISO in this particular regard is to really ask some of those questions around what risk profile are we now operating within? What are the right levels of risk tolerance that the business is happy to accept? Um, it may well be as well that we have to rewrite or change or adapt some of our policies and standards and procedures just to make sure that the new governance framework we've got is really fit for purpose going forward in this new world, in a hybrid environment that we're having to operate in. So it's front and center for me because we're having to do that work right up front. We're having to reassess risk across our businesses, and I think the CISO has a key role to play in that.
And recognizing that the ultimate answer is going to be different for every company, what do you think are the main things that companies need to really take into consideration when they're looking at those policies and standards and their risk tolerance? They on the one hand, it makes a great deal of sense that we need to look at those sorts of things, but it's also as much of an art as it is a science. What are the kind of things that are frequently left off when making those kinds of determinations?
I think the biggest danger that an organization can make, Ken, is to go for a cookie cutter approach. So to fall back on perhaps a long established policy that's in place, and some people listening to this may really sort of sit up and say, well, what's he talking about? I've been using NIST or I've been using ISO and those sorts of things. Um, for me, you see, it's all about fitness for purpose going forward. Um, do you have the correct policy and approach in place that really enables your business to operate effectively across the constraints it's now having to deal with? And I don't expect policies and standards and procedures that you're using within the company anymore to have a very long life. I think they are going to be things that you will be changing, moderating on an ongoing regular business as we begin to see ourselves emerging, hopefully, from recession as quickly as possible, because our working habits will be changing. We're going to see regulators starting to take a really keen interest in all sorts of areas, privacy being one of them. The whole sort of push towards things like track and trace, where we're asking people to gather personal information that perhaps they've never had to gather before in certain parts of the world. That has a real impact, for instance, across Europe with the General Data Protection Regulation there. And so again, companies at all levels are going to have to be constantly adapting and changing, I think, their approach in this area. So for me, in that particular regard, the danger is that people assume this is a do it once, then we've got it done for the next 12 months or so. That isn't the way it needs to be anymore. It needs to be constantly changing. And I think the job of the CISO is really to be tracking the number of times that people come to him or her asking for an amendment to the policy, because that shows that people are really cognizant of them and are really thinking about how their business now needs to take on board some of these guidelines, which, after all, should be in the best interests of both the people and also of the organization.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, especially in view of the fact that your next point in your article is about resilience. And it looks to me like that's in the sense of planning ahead for, unforeseen events and looking at all these different scenarios. The problem with, or the challenge, I should say, with doing this sort of thing is, you don't know necessarily what scenarios you're going to be looking at next. On the one hand, there was some advice coming down the pike for the last several years that one day we would be hit with a global pandemic, but I don't think too many people spent a whole lot of time thinking about that, at least not in the business community. What advice do you give for positioning your company to respond to the unknown like that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's when you talk about things like the pandemic, I think a large number of organizations viewed it as almost, something that was too big to need to consider. The chances were too slim. I think that coming off the back of that, hopefully now we've all learned a lesson in that. And I always recommend that organizations, again, regularly undertake um, cybersecurity exercises where they do play out some of these things that are perhaps somewhat unpalatable. We hope they're never going to happen. But building out the playbook so you know how to respond is really essential. And it's about focusing down on your really critical business assets. What are the things that without which you cannot function as a business? Perhaps reprioritizing based on the learnings that have come from the pandemic and the way that businesses have had to operate. Um, and I think it's about being flexible. It's about engaging as well at all levels in the business so that when something does go wrong, and we've always tended to think about that insecurity from the perspective of, breaches or specific data centers or operating centers being taken out. And so we've talked about how we can have um, backup centers in other parts of the country or other parts of the world and so on. But I think that what the pandemic has done is really show that we need to think much bigger than that. And with the move to adoption of things like cloud and reliance on third parties, we really do need to plan, I think, in much more detail for the time when perhaps our businesses are particularly hampered. And we can learn a lot, I think, from people in critical infrastructure who clearly have to do that on an ongoing basis. Um, but for me, it's all about identifying the most critical business assets, the things you really cannot do without, starting there. How are you protecting them at all stages of the life cycle? And then once you're comfortable with that and have played out certain scenarios and have got your playbook down, moving on to other parts of the business using the knowledge that you've gained from doing that.
I think the pandemic and IT security have something in common that occurred to me as you were talking about this, and that is that businesses are used to making decisions based on the now, based on the things that are happening, based on the things that are quantifiable. And this sort of thing, be it a pandemic or some sort of a security issue, is usually, or oftentimes at least, something that doesn't show up on the radar screen and until it does, really. I'm thinking like in particular of SCADA security.
Hmm.
SCADA hasn't been hit, at least not in any real meaningful way. We've had small attacks along the way, but nothing that's really taken down a whole nation. Yet that risk is very much there. So it's interesting to marry those two concepts together and think, okay, how do I put something together that's going to, that's going to be helpful, but also something that's going to be um, defensible from a corporate point of view, given the imperatives that we have.
I think you're absolutely right, Ken, and I think that one of the challenges we've traditionally faced is that it comes down to this risk assessment, doesn't it? The balance between what's the likelihood of that happening. And I think we've always, to your point, referred back to things like SCADA, or we thought of state-sponsored attacks, and how likely is that to happen in my environment to my organization? And if the answer is, well, it's slim, then we've tended to skate over it. So I think there's a lot of organizations that I'm aware of just reassessing those things in the light of recent experience.
Another thing that you bring up along the way is about how these distributed workforces expand the attack surface. And I would expand that, to some other points that you made in your Forbes article to also include the supply chain and working with partners, et cetera.
Hmm.
I think the common denominator here is that companies are trying to establish security not only across their own networks, across their own network infrastructure and the network network infrastructure that they pay for via the cloud. But they've also got to extend this security to the people who are on their own DSL connections working from home. They've got to extend it to their corporate partners with whom they work, some of whom might have a very different idea about what constitutes security, and try to establish some sort of common denominator across all of that. How do you go about putting together a policy and a procedure to make that happen?
Yeah, the third party risk element, the supply chain, that's something that I'm asked about a lot now, and certainly we're hard at work producing or just finishing off some research again with some new tools that we're going to be releasing in the not too distant future in that particular space that really try to help people address this issue that you have raised. You know, that dependence on third parties, whether it be on a cloud provider, whether it be on um, a new supplier. I think you have to start with, again, I go back to this, I'm beginning to sound like a bit of an old record, I go back to this understanding your critical asset first, because that's, you've got to start with the information. You've got to start with what's important to your business, and you've got to track the flow of that across this extended network that we now have to work with. And it's about trying to identify the hotspots there, those areas that you're comfortable with, where you know that you have perhaps a degree of control and there may be a certain policy that you apply to that, versus those that you're less, um, that you feel might be a bit less secure. Let's
Mhm.
put it that way. And I think that one of the things that is missing for a lot of organizations at the moment is the ability to go out and do some physical audits, some physical checks. If you think about how a lot of businesses have ensured the real integrity of security out in third-party providers, for instance, that if it's an important provider, you've gone and visited, you've gone on site, and so we're having to work around that, and inevitably we're having to look at electronic means to manage that. I think a few things. First is, to your point, you do need a really clear policy that you can share, that really talks about the importance of the asset that is being shared and why it needs to be kept secure in terms that the third party understands. That can be you, it can be me, or it could be a corporation that we're sharing information with. But clearly state the policy and answer the question why. People always need to understand why. And very often we forget that. We state the policy, but we don't tell people why it's important. So
Mhm.
do that piece. Then I think it's about providing some really clear guidance. So if I want you to follow a certain policy, how can I help you do that? What are some key things that you can do that you would put a tick against? What are some things that you shouldn't do that I'd put a cross against? And so again, just bring some clarity to that piece. And then the third thing, which is really important, is providing a communication channel, because all too often these things are open to interpretation. Well, if you're not sure, this is who to talk to. Let's talk it through. Let's discuss it. So you've just implemented, say, a new cloud infrastructure. You're not sure how that's going to affect the data that I share with you. Well, this is the person to talk to about that. They can walk you through what's necessary, what we expect from our side. You can talk to them about what you're providing. And again, I think that we've lost some of that just basic need for interaction in the rush to implement technology because it's so essential. So we need to just step back a little bit, be really clear, open up some communication channels that we know are there, and just signpost, I think, a lot better.
So, Steve, crystal ball time. Looking ahead, looking ahead to the next 12 months.
Yeah.
What do you think? What condition do you think that we'll be in, given the conditions that currently prevail? Or what do you think are going to be the key issues that we're going to be facing? Do you feel like we're going to be making some decent progress? Do you feel like much of this is going to get swept under the rug? Are we going to be I guess, focused on some recent SCADA attack or something at that point, in which case we just move on to the next thing. What's your take?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, Ken. I think
Mm,
that I'd begin by answering that in with the economy. You have to start there. I'm My hope is that, and we're starting to see it already, global economies starting to recover a little bit, but not at the percentages and the volumes that we really need to have a rapid return to where we were pre-pandemic. And I think the pandemic impact is going to be around pretty much through for another 12 months, frankly. And so therefore, we're still going to be struggling with recessionary elements in certain parts of the world. So from a security standpoint, I think that we will still need to be very smart about how we use the resources that are available. I think that the bad guys will undoubtedly continue to see it as a bit of an opportunity over the coming 12 months. I'm not so sure that we're going to see very large scale attacks on, say, critical infrastructure and that kind of thing. I fear that we're going to see an increase in ransomware. I think we're going to see exploitation of mobility. And by that, I mean the fact that will have a dispersed workforce. Very many organizations, as you know, are talking about not having a complete return to work because there's no need to have a return to work. So that means that we're going to have distributed workforces that will be increasingly more common, and that opens up the attack surface. So I think we're going to, unfortunately, have seen an increase in things like spear phishing, malware drops, so potentially denial of service in certain areas coming in through that. How do we emerge from it? I think that security has learned a lot in a very short space of time by having to deal with the pandemic. And I do think that smart organizations will be listening to that. And so we'll be really shoring up some of these defenses to the things I've just been talking about. But I think that we're in for a bit of a bumpy ride over the coming 9 months, certainly. And I think that the organizations that are going to be able to weather that storm effectively are the ones that listen really hard to what has been achieved at a challenging time, embrace the need to have input from security leaders to ensure that the direction the company is going in is as secure as possible, and absolutely need to be really focused about providing the right level of resource throughout the organization. Doesn't just have to be money, it can also be people, and those people do not have to just come from security. So it's about enabling the whole business to understand the role that security has to play. That starts at the top in the boardroom, and those are the sorts of things that I think we'll be seeing over the coming 12 months.
Steve, thank you very much. We've been talking about the article written by Steve Durbin of the Information Security Forum entitled Embracing the New Business World, 5 Key Considerations for CISOs. It was posted September 1st on Forbes. Steve Durbin, Managing Director of the Information Security Forum, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, sir.
Thanks very much indeed, Ken. Always a pleasure.
You've been listening to Avant Technology Insights, featuring information and opinions on how key technologies can be leveraged to solve business problems. Avant Technology Insights is a service of Avant Communications, a platform for IT decision-making. All opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host. For more information, please feel free to download our research reports and other resources at www.goavant.net. That's www.goavant, as in victory, ant.net. For Avant Research and Analytics, this is Ken Presti.